The 50 states and their capitals. Now, I can tell you right now, that could be kind of a challenge. I know a lot of people, they live in these capital cities, and they pretty much know them because they live in them. But if you don't live in a capital city of a state, well, you may not know what states there are, and particularly what their capitals are. So let me make some of this real simple for you. First of all, I live near a city called Decatur, Illinois, and not quite 50 miles away, kind of close, but not quite 50 miles away, is my state capital, Springfield, Illinois. Now, ask just about anyone in the United States about Springfield, Illinois, and they'll probably tell you about Abraham Lincoln. Why? Because when Abraham Lincoln was elected president, he traveled from Springfield, Illinois to the White House in Washington, D.C. Okay? Now, I know Abraham Lincoln wasn't from Springfield, Illinois originally, but that's where he was serving office at the time that he was elected President of the United States. And at that point, he traveled from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C. So when it comes to Illinois' capital, that's very easy to remember. Now, I know some people say, well, the capital of Illinois is Chicago. No, no, no. That just happens to be our biggest city. And I hate to say it, but I've never actually been to Chicago. It's about 300 miles from where I'm at. Not quite 300, but it's close. It's a couple hours drive for me. Anyway, so if you're really thinking about the state capital of Illinois, it is not Chicago. And I know a lot of people might think so because a lot of our politicians in the last few years have come either from Chicago or they're familiar with the people of Chicago, whatever. But really, our capital is in Springfield. Now, another state capital that should be instantaneous to most people is Indianapolis, Indiana. That's an easy one. Gee, anybody that's ever been to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway should know where the state capital of Indiana is. That's easy. But once you get past that, state capitals get to be a little bit harder. Take, for instance, Des Moines, Iowa. Now, some people have actually visited Des Moines, Iowa, but there's a lot of people who haven't. So how would you know that Des Moines was the capital of Iowa? Well, it just so happens that 50 miles north of Des Moines, Iowa, is a little city called Boone, Iowa. Now that doesn't mean a whole lot to anybody, except if anybody's ever heard of the Farm Progress Show, they would know that it takes place every other year in Boone, Iowa. The other times it takes place in my wonderful city, Decatur, Illinois. So, one year the Farm Progress Show takes place in Decatur, Illinois, then the other year it takes place in Boone, Iowa. Now, since Boone, Iowa just happens to be about 50 miles north of Des Moines, Iowa, well, that's a pretty easy way to remember it. Now, a lot of people will say, well, I know the capital of Missouri, that's St. Louis, right? No, it just happens to be the biggest city and also happens to be located on the Mississippi River. So, if St. Louis, Missouri is not the capital of Missouri, what is? Well, it just so happens to be Thomas Jefferson City. That's right, the third president of our United States was Thomas Jefferson, and he had a city named after him called Jefferson, Missouri. Okay? Actually called Jefferson City, Missouri. Jefferson City, Missouri is the state capital of Missouri, and it was named after Thomas Jefferson. And this is not the only time that a city was named after somebody that was involved in the Revolutionary War. Take, for instance, John Lansing. That's right, Lansing, Michigan is named after John Lansing, a hero of the Revolutionary War. Okay. Now, guess what else is true? Do you remember James Madison? That's right, the fourth president of the United States. Well, he had a city named after him, and that was Madison, Wisconsin. That's right. So if you're thinking about Wisconsin, think of James Madison, the 4th President of the United States, and then you'll know the capital of that state. All right. Now, a lot of people will stand there and say, well, we know the capital of Kentucky, it's Louisville or Lexington. Well, there is a Louisville, Kentucky. There is a Lexington, Kentucky. Louisville just happens to be very near the border of Illinois. So, I know there's a Louisville, and I know there's a Lexington. But guess what's between Louisville and Lexington? The real capital of Kentucky, which is Frankfort. And Frankfort was named after a guy named Stephen Frank, who was killed by a bunch of Indians back in the 1780s. That's right. A guy killed by Indians gets a city named after him. And that city ends up being the state capital, Frankfort. Now, anybody who has ever heard of Elvis Presley or has heard of the Grand Ole Opry knows the capital of Tennessee, which happens to be Nashville. And it's not the only famous city in Tennessee, but that is one of the famous cities in Tennessee. Okay? Now, if you pick up a pebble, it's a little rock. And if you happen to pick it up in Arkansas, you've got Little Rock, Arkansas, which is the state capital of Arkansas. So the Arkansas state capital is in Little Rock. Alright. So, we've already established that James Madison had a state capital named after him. Thomas Jefferson also had a state capital named after him. What about Andrew Jackson? Well, he had a state capital named after him too. And that was in Mississippi. So if you travel to Jackson, Mississippi, you will find some history about Andrew Jackson, because that city was named after him. Now, there just so happened to have been a General Richard Montgomery who died in the Revolutionary War. And General Richard Montgomery happens to have a city named after him. That's right, Montgomery, Alabama. So, when you think of Montgomery, Alabama, you think of General Richard Montgomery. Now, as for Atlanta, Georgia, I'm not going to go into too many details here. I will tell you that the Turner Networks, Ted Turner Networks, are all based in Atlanta, Georgia. Also, the Weather Channel is based in Atlanta, Georgia. So that's a real easy one to remember. Alright. And of course, we also have Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Baton Rouge, Louisiana was recently, well, kind of what we call devastated, if you want to get into it. It was devastated by Hurricane Katrina. Now, I know New Orleans was also devastated, but Baton Rouge was devastated too. And if you check out the history of Hurricane Katrina, you'll see that Baton Rouge, Louisiana took a pounding from Hurricane Katrina. And it just so happens to be the state capital of Louisiana. Now, a lot of people are familiar with Daytona, Florida. They're also familiar with Miami, Florida. But if you were looking for the capital of Florida, don't look at either place. That's right, you have to go to a place called Tallahassee, Florida. And in Tallahassee, Florida, you will find the state capital of Florida. Tallahassee in itself was an old Indian word meaning old town or old field. Okay. Now, what about Columbus, Ohio? Well, that was Christopher Columbus, Ohio. That's right, Christopher Columbus had a city named after him, and that city happens to be the capital of Ohio. And finally, Austin, Texas. Now, I'm sure that people are familiar with San Antonio, Houston, and Dallas, even Galveston, but none of these towns are the capital of Texas. Austin is the capital of Texas. Alright, so, where are all these states? Well, for those of you who live in Illinois, you know that Iowa is to the northwest of Illinois, Missouri is to the southwest of Illinois, Kentucky is to the southeast of Illinois, straight east from Illinois is Indiana, north of Illinois is Michigan, and northeast of Illinois is Wisconsin. Now, if you go south of Missouri, you're going to hit Arkansas, and if you go south of Arkansas, you're going to hit Louisiana. West of Louisiana is Texas. East of Louisiana is Mississippi, and east of Mississippi is Alabama, and east of Alabama is Georgia, and south of Georgia is Florida. Now, the best way to remember the southern states, especially if you don't live there, is to remember the Smokey and the Bandit movie. That's right, because you see, Bandit drove from Texarkana, Texas to Georgia to transport that Coors beer. And if you watch that movie, you will see the order of each state that he traveled through, and by knowing that sequence, you will know the southern states from west to east. Okay. And if you watch Smokey and the Bandit 2, you can include Florida in that, because they traveled all the way down to Florida, I believe it was Miami, in the second movie, to transport an elephant. So, Smokey and the Bandit can help you remember the southern states. For those of you who live in the Midwest, well, all you have to do is look in different directions from Illinois, and you'll see all the wonderful states. Now, Ohio is actually east of Indiana. So you go from Illinois to Indiana to Ohio. There you go. Alright, I will tell you more about the state capitals and the states themselves in a future video, so stay tuned.